Please note, artifacts, Slytherin said from his seat. I duly object to this method of transportation. Hufflepuff raised her voice in the wind. Quiet, Salazar. It makes perfect sense, as Rowena has pointed out. Indeed. Since we do not know the exact location of the girl's cottage, we cannot disapparate to it, Gryffindor said. And brooms would be too conspicuous within the Muggle territories. We are trying to create a rather lower profile these days, after all. This method allows us to explore the wood while remaining incognito, as it were. It is a pumpkin, Slytherin declared carefully. It is a sledge, Ravenclaw corrected stridently. It may still look a bit like a pumpkin, not to mention the smell, Slytherin interjected. But it will work perfectly for our purposes. And the reindeer do add a rather quaint touch, if I do say so myself. I continue to think of them as mice, Slytherin sniffed. I'd like to instruct our bard to record them as such, since both they and this sledge will return to their original forms at, what time? Ravenclaw sighed. Midnight. Look, I cannot help it. This sort of magic has built-in limitations. It isn't as if this is a typical transfiguration. I'd never have been able to maintain such a thing for the entire night. This is fairy magic. I learned it from my godmother. I've always wanted to attempt it. We appreciate you allowing us to participate, Slytherin proclaimed loftily. How long do we have, Merlinus? Gryffindor asked from the front seat of the sledge, snapping the reins. The werewolf attacks the young lady Gabriella upon her return to her cottage at precisely 5 minutes after the 11th hour, Merlin replied. The wolf intends to ambush her, thus you must dispatch it before her return, and the girl must never know of our involvement. That would complicate matters. Hufflepuff turned curiously, remembering something. Earlier, you called the werewolf clever. What did you mean by that? My dear madam, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. Allow me to simply declare that this werewolf, whilst in his human form, is a small muggle lord and a writer of stories. Not particularly good stories, by all accounts. This may be more interesting than heretofore expected, Slytherin acknowledged, smiling. The sledge moved smoothly through the forest, cresting hills and weaving between trees. All around, the snow-covered landscape glittered blue in the full moon. Ice sparkled on the bare branches, crackling as the reindeer charged through them. It's getting late, Ravenclaw called after a while. We'll never find the cottage in time at this rate. We need more eyes on the search. Should we split up? Not unless you brought more pumpkins, Gryffindor replied. I may be able to help, Hufflepuff said, sitting up in her seat. Artifacts, do you still have any of those gingerbread biscuits? I don't have any gingerbread biscuits, the young man stammered. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, madam. Oh, good grief, Artifacts, we're witches and wizards, Gryffindor called. It takes a lot more than quick fingers to hide biscuits from us. They're in your right breast pocket. You don't mind sharing, do you? Artifacts patted his pocket theatrically. Oh, these! No, of course not. I'd forgotten all about them. Here you are, Madam Hufflepuff. Hufflepuff took the large gingerbread biscuit from Artifacts and held it up. She smiled askance at the others. I've always wanted to try this, she proclaimed. Carefully, she raised her wand in the rocking sledge and then touched it to her forehead. After a moment, she drew the wand away again, producing a long, silvery strand which flowed silently in the cold air. Just like with the pensieve, Ravenclaw commented, watching. But what will you do with it? Without answering, Hufflepuff held the gingerbread biscuit up, draping the silvery thread over and around it. Suddenly, she snapped the wand away from the biscuit, breaking the strand off and leaving it twined around the biscuit, where it slowly vanished. And what precisely, Slytherin began, but his words froze as the biscuit jumped in Hufflepuff's hand. Quite suddenly, the biscuit changed shape, sprouting 2 rudimentary legs, stubby arms, and a large, flat head. The candies that had adorned the biscuit became the tiny figure's eyes, while a dimple in the face formed a simple, smiling mouth. "Very nice," Merlin commented appreciatively. "A gingerbread man to help us search. He has the only requirement necessary. He has eyes." Hufflepuff nodded proudly. "And he shall be fast, lest any hungry peasants encounter him on his way." To the gingerbread man she said, "We are looking for a cottage with a broken vane next to the chimney. If you should find it, return to us as fast as you can and lead us there." "I shall run as fast can be," the gingerbread man proclaimed in its shrill little voice, jumping up and down on Hufflepuff's hand. "They'll never catch me." A moment later, the tiny man bounded off the front of the sledge and raced off into the moonlit wood, kicking up a plume of snow and weaving a trail through the trees. "This is patently ridiculous," Slytherin announced. "For the record." Speaking of which," Artifex replied, looking up from his parchment, "is this a good time to ask about King Kriegel again? As the bard and recorder, I feel strongly that I should be aware of such things." "Now is as good a time as any, I suppose," Gryffindor answered, scanning the trees as the sledge swooped over the hills. "Helga, you understand the legend as well as anyone." Hufflepuff nodded. "It is quite simple, really. When King Kriegel ascended to the throne as first king of the Wizarding World, a war had been waging between 2 factions of the magical world for centuries. On one side was Goblinkind, whom you know. On the other was Elfinkind, whom you do not, since they are long gone from our world. The source of their enmity was long forgotten, but the essential seed of their conflict was always before them. They were too similar to accept each other's differences, but too different to appreciate each other's similarities. The elves were a very wise race, tiny and cunning, but most importantly, they were time weavers. They knew how to manipulate time, both in small ways, individually, and in large ways when they worked together. It was this very skill that led King Kriegel to design a plan. With the assistance of the Council of the Elven Leaders, they chose the most remote place on Earth as the location of the most ambitious unplottability enchantment ever. There, they created a new nation for the elves, hidden not only in space, but time, existing in a bubble of history created by, and only accessible to, the elves themselves. Every elf on Earth migrated to their new nation, except for those that we now know of as house elves, who chose of their own volition to stay. Artifex had been scribbling furiously, but he suddenly looked up. "Why would they do that?" Merlin answered. "The elves were a proud, arrogant race. Those who had intermingled with goblin-kind became self-loathing and subservient. Lowering themselves to the status of servants and slaves, they believed they might eventually pay penance for their mixed heritage, and one day earn entrance into the hidden elven nation." Slytherin commented, "So they get their final reward, and we get cheap manual labor. I'd say it is a winning arrangement for all involved." "Coming to the point," Hufflepuff went on, "the goblins were glad to see the elves gone from the world they knew, but they lived in perpetual suspicion of the Wizarding King who'd worked with the elves to arrange their exodus. For the elves' part, however, legend says that the elven leaders promised to repay King Kriegel for his wisdom and effort. They vowed to spirit him away to their realm upon his death. True to their word, the stories declare that, decades later, the elven leaders returned to our world mere moments before the king's death, taking him away with them, never to be seen again. There, in their timeless realm, he supposedly lives still, restored and vibrant, perhaps even watching over us who are left in our own world." "I admit," Artifex said as he stopped writing, "it sounds like quite a fairy tale. Not a bad story, but a story nonetheless." "The boy shows promise," Slytherin declared heartily. "Look," Gryffindor interrupted, pointing. "Our little friend returns." Sure enough, as the occupants of the sledge leaned forward, peering into the darkness, a tiny figure sped through the wood, looping through the trees and kicking up a rooster tail of snow in its wake. As it approached the sledge, it leapt into the air, landing easily on Hufflepuff's outstretched hand. "You have a report for us?" she asked as Gryffindor brought the sledge to a halt. "I do," the tiny gingerbread man trilled. "I was chased by 3 muggles, 2 wizards, a fox, 15 pigs, and 1 very persistent raven." "I mean," Hufflepuff said, looking aside at the others, "did you find the cottage?" The gingerbread man bowed low on her hand. "Indeed I have. You must follow the northern star down yonder hill. It lies just beyond the wood, not 5 minutes hence." Gryffindor snapped the reins, returning the sledge in the direction the gingerbread man had reported. "We haven't much time," he called as the sledge picked up speed, swooshing down the hill and weaving through the trees. "It is nearly 11 of the clock now. The wolf will attack soon, lest we arrive in mere minutes." The occupants of the sledge held on grimly as the reindeer loped through the snow, pulling the sledge faster and faster. The trees began to thin, and the sledge suddenly humped over a stand of frozen bushes, slamming down into a thick drift. Snow exploded all around, blinding the riders for a long, tense moment. When it cleared, Gryffindor suddenly pulled the reins, halting the reindeer in the snow and forcing the sledge to slew crookedly to a stop. "Why do we stop?" Ravenclaw cried, leaning forward. "The cottage is there, within sight, just over this snowy plain. We could walk it in 5 minutes." "This is no snowy plain," Gryffindor stated flatly, pointing. The others looked. "Ah, yes," Slytherin said, settling back into his seat. "It is a frozen lake. How perfectly disappointing. It shall never support our weight."
"It supported me with nary a problem,"
the gingerbread man said from where it stood on Hufflepuff's hand. Ravenclaw stirred anxiously in her seat. "Do we have time to go around?" "I think not," Gryffindor said gravely. "Turn your gaze to the east. Do you see?" "The young witch returns even now," Merlin said, peering in the moonlight. Sure enough, a small pinpoint of light marked the progress of a small figure in a red cloak, picking its way through the trees that surrounded the lake. A lantern bobbed at the figure's side as she neared the cottage.
"What shall we do, friends?" Hufflepuff asked quickly. "I refuse to believe that we came this far, finding the truth of Merlin's mission, only to fail at the last."
Gryffindor turned slowly in the front seat of the sledge, a smile spreading above his narrow goatee. "There is something," he said slowly, "that I have always wanted to try."